quality, and habitat improvement goals. Our next clean water conversation is on Thursday, May 9th at 12 p.m. Speakers from Brattleboro Housing Partnerships, Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission, Connecticut River Conservancy, and the Vermont River Conservancy will discuss clean water projects improving flood resiliency. The link to register will be added to the chat at the end of today's presentation. Today's conversation will begin with a presentation from our speakers, followed by a question and answer period. You can write your questions in the chat and I will read them during the Q&A, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A to verbally ask your question. This conversation is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Staci Pomeroy. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. Yep. I am a river scientist with Vermont DEC's Rivers program. I help look at the stream geomorphic and physical considerations. I'll let Ned introduce himself and then we'll pick up our presentation.
Hi, I'm Ned Swanberg. I'm a regional floodplain manager in Washington and Orange County. I'm also working with people around the state in anticipation of the new maps coming from FEMA in the next couple of years and trying to update bylaws for flood resilience. So thank you so much for letting me be with you today.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my slides with you now. All right, can everyone see my slides? Great, thank you. So today, as was mentioned, Ned and I will talk about flood resiliency, considerations of water quality, and habitat as well. We're looking at those things that have worked and how have we learned these things. Our program and partners across the state work to meet many goals around our rivers, looking at flood resiliency, water quality, and habitat. In many instances, those projects overlap. When we're out on the stream, what are we thinking about? What should we be thinking about? It may depend on what your viewpoint is coming into the project, correct? But in many instances, we have the opportunity to work together and overlap those goals, and they're important and they do overlap. I'd like to step back a little bit and put some reflection on how we've gotten to where we are and how we think about our rivers and the type of flood response water quality projects that we do. So when I started with the program back in the 1990s, the floods there generated a lot of damage, and the state took the time to reflect back on what things worked and what did we see that didn't work. And Act 137 was put forward as one of our first steps towards understanding better flood control policies and a flood control program, which became the Rivers program as it evolved. What we took away from the Act 137 work and the study to understand what happened from our channel management was that traditional approaches to river management in structure sizes were no longer working. They often caused damage in the river itself. They often set the river up for failure in future floods, and that we weren't planning for long-term strategies. So we needed to evaluate our strategies more. Because we found that traditional practices didn't work, we decided to take a new approach. We looked to use the science, and we looked to use engineering that incorporated more of the science in that, using a natural channel design restoration project. The Trout River project up in Montgomery was the first project to utilize this. You'll notice that I have a circle that says channel blocks that failed 3 times. While we can engineer our way into a good project, we also needed to realize that nature is nature. It moves and wants to change, and our projects need to incorporate that. The program decided that after fixing that failed block 3 times, that the best approach would be to work with the landowner to protect that area to allow the river to move and change over time. As you can see in one of the most recent orthos, that meander that was cut off has now become an incredible beaver complex and vegetated area. It's a very dynamic location and very exciting to see how that has evolved over time. What it really showed us is that we often needed to think about both flooding and our river projects in a more comprehensive way and thinking about what is a river corridor. Those corridors allow for areas for the stream to move over time. They allow for investments to be protected against current and future developments, and they provide space for buffers and other wildlife considerations. The idea of having space for the river to move over time became a feature in the Rivers program to think about. Those projects in that flood also taught us that we needed to think about streams and more of the science. And many of you have participated in our stream geomorphic assessment projects over time, gathering more information about the stream characteristics that we see in our landscape. This is just a basic overview of some of the types of streams that we see in our landscape and how they are different in their functions across how they move water, sediment, and debris is important as we think about what we do for different types of projects. I encourage you as you drive across Vermont and you see streams to think about some of these stream characteristics that you might notice. Think about the valley that you're driving through. Can you see the streams move? Is it straight or is it sinuous? Do you notice if it has small materials or large materials? Those are important things that we began to learn as we did more stream geomorphic assessment in our state. We also learned that it's important for us to incorporate sediment and large wood material as a function of our streams. Streams move water, sediment, and debris as they transport across the landscape. This is important because those materials provide important resistance in the stream to help slow velocities as it moves down through the slopes. It also provides important complex habitat that we want to maintain in our streams. We also learned that it's important for us to have important habitat features as part of our projects. Those aquatic and terrestrial habitat are important for not only the fish and wildlife, but for the things that we value for those fish and wildlife in our landscapes. Thinking about our project in the Trout River really showed us that strategies that we use for flood mitigation are affected by where we're at and the type of stream that we're working on. The more we learn about those features in our landscape, the more opportunity we have for success of our projects. A next piece of the science that we took away from those floods early on was that we needed to better understand the vertical and lateral connections and the process by those that the stream happens. How connected is our channel and our floodplains? Inundation flooding is a way that we can think about the vertical connection of the channel to the floodplain. Many of us have used the FEMA maps as we think about those 10-year, 50-year, or 100-year events. But really what that is saying is what's the statistical percent chance in any given year for that flood event to happen. So for example, the 100-year floodplain is really saying we have a 1% chance in any year for water to access that floodplain. How connected is our floodplain to the channel for that water to get up onto and relieve some of that pressure in the channel over time? The other piece that we had to really think more about was the lateral connection. the erosion flooding that happens. A stable river is not a static river. It will move over time. Think back to that idea of the river corridor. Providing space for the river to move over time is important. The last little bit of channel characteristics that we need to think about as we look at our projects is that longitudinal connection. How well are things moving from upstream to downstream? The stream needs to move water, sediment, and debris, large wood material. And if we have things like culverts or other features that restrict those flows, it will change how the river works. We want to think about those in our projects as we do this work. Last key concept that I'll use as we took away from the work that we looked at in the 90s was really understanding that rivers have a balance. It's a dynamic balance. It's a dynamic equilibrium. They're always moving material, changing, filling, eroding. But our goal with our projects is not to tip this balance too much. If we tip the balance too much, the river will change. If we have more power than resistance in the channel, we will see erosion happening on the bed or the banks. If we have more resistance, we will have more aggradation or building up of the channel. Rivers do this naturally over time, and as we do projects in the river, our goal is not to tip that too much. Because we would like success for our projects. What we saw is many of the traditional approaches that have been taken for flood recovery and response often tipped that balance too much. It set our rivers up for failure in future flood events, and it also caused damages or less success in our projects because the river was responding. We took away from the projects in the 90s the understanding that we need to work more comprehensively with our streams in order to have better success and maintain a better balance in our system. The next big flood event that has occurred was Tropical Storm Irene. What did we learn in the intervening years, and how is that applied during that time? We really learned that messaging matters. This one headline from Governor Shumlin kicked off a run to dig in our streams by those who thought that they knew what was best, and the science had been ignored. We tipped the balance too much in many areas, and many areas were set up for failure in future floods. We needed to come back to the science and make sure that messaging around what type of work, where the work was done, and why the work was done was better received and understood, not just putting a blank statement out for what kind of work should be done everywhere, because not all streams are the same, and projects for success do not happen the same in all areas. The other thing that we saw was that habitat matters, and the type of work that we did greatly affected those. The example on the right is of Gilead Brook. This was unfortunately work was done to try to improve the stream to convey more water after the flood. The stream was bulldozed. Sadly, what happened was it also took away all that nice sediment and wood that provided the resistance and the habitat. This left the stream more vulnerable, and we had impacts to our fish and wildlife. We really needed to make sure in future projects we incorporated that habitat and understanding more holistically. Those projects that went wrong provided opportunities for lessons learned. Areas that saw damage in the past events saw damages again, and strategies to fix the damages were not working. People installing the projects did not know how the rivers worked. They did the best they could, knowing what they know about road repair, but they didn't know much about the rivers. For VTrans, there were approximately 250 sites that have been damaged and that had to go back and be repaired or redone in order to make them more stable and reduce damages to the river. The Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources recognize that if we are to have a better response the next time, we need to provide training to those who are responding. Both the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources leaned into the idea that roads, in concert with streams and rivers, could do better the next time. Because Vermont experiences both inundation and erosion during flooding, there is a need to plan for both. With only 20% of Vermont's streams mapped on the NFIP maps, the true amount of possible flooding on various streams is unknown, or has been considered not a risk if it was not mapped. The NFIP maps focus on inundation and don't show any potential risk of erosion. Elevation to avoid inundation is often not effective in protecting structures from erosion during flooding. Many of these homes do not have flood insurance and are not mapped in floodplains, and this limits the type of FEMA flood recovery funding that can occur to these homes, and it also sets people up for limiting the understanding of the true risk that they have during flooding. Another sad lesson that we learned from Tropical Storm Irene and other floods is that without state standards for adopting the structure sizes and permitting requirements, FEMA would only pay for those in-kind structures. Without FEMA funding to support changes in structures, many towns could not afford to put in larger structures and were set up for future failure in the next flood. Replacing a structure with the same structure that failed the first time meant we would likely see failure in future flooding. A silver lining that we saw from Tropical Storm Irene and other efforts was that it does take local champions to make things happen. The community recognized in Jeffersonville that development that was planned in a floodplain would have effects and changes on flooding in the village that could increase flooding in different areas. The community rallied and they worked to protect 4.2 acres of development. The community worked to protect 4.2 acres from being developed at a cost of $402,000 to raise that money. Through various efforts, the community worked to do that effort. As with the floods in the 90s, the legislature looked once again to determine what might be useful to put into law to help us move forward in future events. Act 138 was passed. It provided an opportunity for A&R to regulate activities that were exempt from municipal regulations. It provided an opportunity for the state to develop and make available river corridor maps for municipalities and incentives for adopting those corridors, thinking about room for the river to move. It provided us additional guidance and support in our stream alteration rule, making emergency protective measures and standards to be used and developed so that we would have less damage in future responses. And it encouraged and required us to develop training to improve the response and reduce impacts from future flooding. Sadly, 12 years later, in 2023, we saw additional statewide flooding, both in July and in December. How have we done this time around? Well, we have had improvements. In 2017, FEMA approved our A&R stream alteration as a codes and standards standards mattered. By having these standards in place through the dedicated work of our program and others, we had an opportunity in this flood to replace structures with structures that fit the channel and met our standards, and FEMA would pay for those. We also had in place better standards and practices. So when work was done by those who were trying to do flood recovery, they had standards to follow and we saw less damage. We had higher success in installing things correctly the first time. We saw less damages by those features that have been installed correctly between 2017 and current day. We made good progress. We still have progress to go, but we've made good progress, less damage. We've continued our training since 2012 with the Rivers and Roads program. It's a 3-tier training that provides a mix of to a group of folks from road crews to municipalities to conservation districts and watershed partners with a training around the basics of river dynamics and the state standards in flood recovery response. This time around, the training has paid off. We heard through anecdotes through many folks, our stream alteration people and other partners, that folks had a better understanding of what was being asked of them to do when they were doing flood recovery work. They also knew ahead of time of things that they should do. Education is important, and we continue to have these trainings yearly. Messaging still matters. There are still calls to dredge the river. This time around, there was more effort to make those quick flood recovery responses and long-term flood recovery strategies more informed. You may ask why there are folks from all sectors of our agency, Governor Phil Scott to all the secretaries in the different agencies, why they need to learn about flooding. It is because each of these agencies were impacted by the flooding and are part of the solutions that we need to implement over time. We need to work together across our programs, agencies, and partners in order to ensure long-term success. Another important thing that we saw this time around was the state had put together the Flood Resiliency Community Funds. And this was put in place by the state with federal funds and state funds that were needed to respond to the flood recovery efforts faster and to provide a greater range of projects to be funded that often did not fit FEMA funds. This was a great success, and the state continues to look at funding opportunities around both flood response and other natural resource considerations and concerns for climate change and other efforts. I circle back to Jeffersonville. We still need those important community sponsors, and we have seen success since the 2011-2012 flood, when Jeffersonville decided that they would move forward with hazard mitigation planning and implementation of projects. Those projects circled in yellow and highlighted are just a handful of the projects that they have worked on and implemented in the last 10 years. It was important because they saw less flooding in the community during this flood event. They continue to move forward. Those efforts around protection of the floodplain and other natural resource projects is important. The Vermont's Functioning Floodplain Initiative continues to highlight how protection of floodplain and working with rivers provides important benefits for ecological considerations, economical considerations. In this past, recently, FEMA has passed the process by which those environmental benefits can be considered as part of their benefit cost analysis in projects. This helped Jeffersonville move forward several of their projects as they were able to demonstrate protecting the floodplain and doing other resource projects helped reduce flooding in the community. These are important initiatives for us to keep communities aware of. And we are still learning. So 27 years after the flooding in 1997 that devastated Montgomery and kicked off the Rivers program towards a holistic river management, I have attended a meeting in Montgomery this March around their continued flood flood resiliency and hazard mitigation study and work. So it's important and it's long term. These flooding efforts, each time we continue to learn and move forward with important strategies as we get more data and information about what works and what considerations can be done around our river systems. For those of you who might be interested to learn more about some of our work, here's a resource page and links that you could have from the presentation. I will pause there and stop sharing. Unless there's some questions, we'll hold off and I'll stop sharing to let Ned share.
Great, thank you, Staci. I'm going to try to follow in here. I'm actually having intermittent power and having difficulty with internet connection. So right now I'm running on a hotspot and I wasn't able to see your slides at all. So Julia, can you see the slide that's up right now?
I can see them, yeah.
You can. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up there. At the next point in a moment. Do you see the flooding slide now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So, Staci, thank you so much for the comprehensive viewpoint of what's been happening in Vermont and how the technical interventions and the learning process has been unveiled and developing. I'm touching perhaps right now more on a broad level about what's going on in the flooding aspect of things, and that's in part because this is a very big and powerful group, very involved in our communities, our rivers and streams and restoration work, and really having the conversations at the municipal level in which we're finding people that are really important to making the changes that we need to be looking at together. So let me just kind of continue along here with these pieces. We have flooding in Vermont. This is a very common feature in the North Temperate Zone, and certainly after the recession of the glaciers 14,000 years ago, we got to figure out how to live with rivers and with flooding as a feature. Major floods in Vermont are quite important and periodical, and it's something we need to understand. Back in 1927, we're still not at the 100th anniversary of that event. We had over 9 inches of rain in Somerset and an extensive area along the Green Mountains. Back in Tropical Storm Irene, we ended up with a similar pattern on the right, where you can see a lot of rain in particularly southern Vermont, over 7 inches, and up into the Orange County area. On the left, you can see the new pattern that popped up in this last July with, again, heavy precipitation across the spine of the Green Mountains. So lots of rain is likely to happen, particularly being intercepted with hot, moist air hitting the cool, mossy mountains of the place we live. Looking at this is a tool where I can kind of understand a little bit about where the risk is for people that are living in our landscape. And it's showing that there are structures, over 12,000 structures already in the special flood hazard area, the high risk flood hazard area in the state. And number one is Bennington, which is not on the recent list. But how do we get communities to be thinking ahead and taking this message about flood resilience to heart and to make the changes before disaster? And you can see right after Bennington, Berry City and Montpelier. Not too far below that, we can see Waterbury and Ludlow. There's a number of communities that have had recent experiences and are desperately trying to figure out what to do to make things better going forward. So a lot to work on. At the Flood Ready website, we have some information about the communities and what we can learn about them. There's a lot of data that is available to us. In the case of Wilmington, it's actually the situation where we can understand a little bit about how many structures are there, how many flood insurance policies are in place, and so forth. We can use the maps that are available to us in a variety of formats, but including the maps from FEMA, the flood insurance rate maps, to characterize some of the risk in the community and kind of pick away at that by using the flood insurance study and the maps themselves. Right now, there is an update underway, as you're probably aware, by FEMA to come up with improved digital flood insurance rate maps. And there's three basic kinds of data we're anticipating. Number one, and the one that's most important, is really new Zone A information, which is the information available through approximate studies, typically where there's just somebody putting eyes on it, but nobody doing survey information or bringing in information about bridges and culverts into the study. And this Zone A information has been very loose, very hard to entirely deal with on the landscape, because sometimes it's missing the stream or the wetland entirely. And so this new data is going to be far more precise and far more accurate and easier and more important to work with. The other kinds of data we'll see are redelineated detailed studies or Zone AE situations using the new high quality contours from LiDAR. So again, much more precise, but really old data. And finally, in a few places, we're going to see new detailed studies with new Zone AE information and base flood elevations and also floodway data. So on this image, you can see a little bit about what's going on in this new format. So on the left, we have the traditional FEMA maps that are looking at floodplains on ponds and lakes, but primarily on rivers. And they're based on gauge data, and they're looking at the discharge from the gauge and kind of spelling out where the water came from by tributary, the size of the watershed on the tributary, the elevation, the latitude, the wetlands and lakes and ponds, the gradient. And so how to ascribe where the water is coming from back up through the watershed. On the right, they're doing a new process this time, again, for the Zone A data, which is to say that they're looking at essentially a rain on grid model, where they're basically modeling water falling on the landscape and tracing the water as it moves from 1 2-meter square to the next 2-meter square, flowing toward the stream and into the wetland and into the river, and then combining that with detailed studies where available or where created on the river itself. So it's going to have a whole different character to it. And the attempt is really, in this new approach with rain on grid, to be capturing more pluvial flooding that, if you would think of it as major stormwater events, and it'll be picking up more wetland situations and beaver flowage and stuff where in the past, nobody in town said, hey, it's worth going up there because nobody lives up there. There's nothing happening up in the woods. And so just stay away from that. But in the meantime, since those maps were created, there are people up there. And it's important to be knowing something about what's going on in the landscape. So this is on the left, an existing Zone A map that we have showing in purple, and so it's approximate methods. On the right is a version of the new product for the same stream, same location. In this case, the blue hatched marks are the Zone A special flood hazard area, and this computer-based base level engineering two-dimensional modeling is also creating another dimension, which is the 0.2% annual chance event, or the 500-year flood, the next larger flood modeled by the FEMA process, being delivered at the same time. So some little bit of change in terms of the Zone A, and then more data about adjacent risk. This is an example of the data coming together. I'm not actually getting the PowerPoint to function, so it's just giving me a general image. So I'm sorry, I'm going to skip along here. This is the effective firm on the left. This is a redelineated situation. So this is the current firm where you can see the special flood hazard area and the floodway. And then on the new firm with the draft map coming in, what they're taking is the old data, but they're using the higher quality topographic data. So you'll see a slightly more intricate boundary on it. And they'll be bringing in the same floodway data, and they'll bring in also some of the other adjacent data relative to this. So up in this case, you can see a little blue swath, which is a new zone A from base level engineering coming in as well as the study. Here's a gauge that I just really want to point out. This is on the Mad River up in Moortown. And you can see at the top, the USGS has indicated on the gauge some of the historical flood levels, high water marks at the gauge, measuring what's happened. So at the top, November 1927, the major flood in Vermont. And then below that, August 2011 on the Mad River. Way down here around knee level is the event that happened in December. And below that, July on the Mad River. So very small flows in these most recent events on the Mad. But within 100 years, we've had a couple of major events, and yet the Q100, the 1% annual chance discharge that will be mapped on the new redelineated but old study for the Mad will be indicating a flood that's of a much smaller size. And so my point is simply that a lot of us assume that the FEMA maps are giving us the map of the flood, the map of the place that we should be paying attention to and be careful about. Ecologically, we might be paying more attention to more frequent small flooding, but in terms of public safety, this is really also not the size that perhaps conveys the important information for public safety. It's really the insurance program sized flood, and it's not designed for really other purposes per se. This is a quick synopsis of where they are doing the detailed studies around the state. So I'm happy to talk more about that as we get a chance. So just looking around Vermont, we're expecting new data coming together, watershed by watershed. That'll come up to be reviewed by the communities as work maps and preliminary maps, and eventually becoming effective. And in this case, we're probably looking at the earliest data becoming effective in Chittenden County, probably Franklin, Grand Isle, Lamoille, and the last data becoming effective by county in southern Vermont, so Bennington, Windham, and Rutland. Going back to what we're all aware of in this group today is that floodplains have multiple benefits, co-benefits of a lot of different pieces. So in part, they're places where we can expect floodwater to be and to move and to carry ice and debris and sediment. They're also places that are important for keeping water clean by trapping sediments and nutrients and building soil. I've heard it said that, a floodplain restoration project creating flood benches can capture more phosphorus than putting in an entirely new municipal wastewater treatment facility. These are also places that often coincide with our aquifers and water recharge for groundwater, places for agriculture and forestry, wildlife, natural communities, and they're often very central to our community identity and places that we all love to be and recreate. So these features are all part of our dialogue with the community, and the public safety piece is part of that. So as Staci has identified, one of the key things here is that we're trying to understand rivers and streams and floodplains in a more complex way all the time. And in part, it's understanding the geomorphic features of the landscape and the movement of liquids through solids, as well as simply the exposure of the landscape to inundation through flooding. And these things together are really important to our communities and in the dialogue that we have with people when we're standing by the river or we're talking to municipal officials to understand these things. So, the river corridor is trying to provide the space, the room needed by the river to move laterally and to not dig down in size and become disconnected from the floodplains. And if we can have it stay connected to the floodplains and meander and take its long, slow, sweet time down the valley, it's going to show up in town, at the hamlet, at the village, in the city, off peak. It's not going to show up at the same time. And it's going to be basically by accessing the floodplains, spreading out, slowing down. It's really the breaks in the watershed system. So these are critical aspects of how the floodplains can continue to function for us in the terms of public safety as well. So one of the pitches that I'm really trying to bring to all of our communities around the state is the importance of thinking about this in terms of no adverse impact. And you may have heard of this in other situations, but this is something that really resides with municipal action as the primary place where development is regulated in Vermont. And so really within these areas that we've identified as the area room needed by the river corridor, don't build any closer in there than what's already there. You know, leave the room for the river that's still available to the river. And that benefits all of us and keeps us from losing money through disasters and losing houses and workplaces and having communities in crisis. The other thing is within the special flood hazard area, the place exposed to inundation, to not be filling that in and displacing water onto others and causing damage to people that had been dry or exposing them to more risk and more water. So all these things are part of how we're trying to have floodplains function for us for the common public purpose. As you probably know, there's a program, ERAF, which again is not advancing for me. But that provides benefits for communities that take steps to avoid damage. You also are probably aware that across the United States, big sections of the country and the world are facing different hydrologic regimes, becoming drier, becoming wetter, and we're becoming wetter. So it's really important. Since the 70s, we've been watching increase in precipitation, which really is changing the situation that we're finding in the landscape. And we can anticipate that. The FEMA maps are all based on what's come up to date or what came up to date in the 70s when they last updated that reach of river. But we can anticipate that things are different than they were, and they will become more different. On the right, as you probably know very well from the press, you know, we're looking at the warmest tropical ocean temperatures that we've had in record. So this is, you know, warmer than last July. And when we had 100-degree temperatures in the water off of Florida, and the plumes of water came up and snaked around the Appalachians and landed in Vermont for our bad luck. But we can anticipate that going forward, we're in a very different situation, and all the things that we're working toward for water quality and habitat and public safety and spending money where we need to be spending money for each other, all these things are in jeopardy as we're kind of moving into this whole new landscape. This is a quick piece from a slide by Gurovich from UVM. They did a study looking at the Champlain Valley, and these graphs really were very compelling for me when I saw it. But they were looking here on the left, it says floodplain restoration. If you go in there, and this is kind of back of the envelope, simple calculations, but they said if you went in and you did maximum floodplain restoration work and wetland restoration work, we would actually reduce damages for people by income across multiple incomes, and reduce damages of different types of living structures and commercial structures. So it would be, as we hope, a gain to our society and our sustainability moving forward. But if you throw in the kinds of effects that we're looking at through increased precipitation and climate change, we're really looking at things going massively in the wrong direction. And on the far right, you can see massively in the wrong direction with the best efforts we can make at floodplain restoration. So I think we need to be doing all this hard work that we're doing, but we need to understand that we need to be doing this in the scale of our global situation that we have in common with everybody. So lots going on, lots to talk about and figure out. I guess I just finished with 4 quick points, but just we need to be protecting what works. We need to be protecting the floodplain functions and the wetland functions, the river corridors where they still exist, because these are part of the natural ecosystem functions that serve us all. We also need to be improving those functions where they're already lost. And we know about places that, from the work done with the geomorphic assessments and the river corridor plans and the work that you're very aware of, there's places with berms and fill and places that have really needing attention to recover floodplain functions and make them work as best as they can. We need to be reducing the risk for existing families and workplaces and services that we all count on. And that's all part of this effort. We need to be planning for flood response because we're going to have more floods. We need to be planning for flood resilience and bouncing ahead because we're going to have lots of jarring, expensive, difficult, priority reshaping disasters ahead. But we don't need to choose that. We need to choose a more successful path ahead. So I'm going to stop there and throw it back to Julia, and we can take questions that might pop up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you both so much for presenting. I'm going to paste some links from today's conversation into the chat, and then if anyone has any questions, feel free to either write them in the chat or to raise your hand to speak them out loud.
This is Erin. Sorry, I don't know where my raise hand function is on my phone. I'm calling in from my phone. I just want to say that was an amazing presentation by both Staci and Ned. I just, oh my gosh, I just spent an hour with like 2 amazing people. And so I very much appreciate you taking the time to present your thoughts and the history and share more about how we need to work with our rivers to allow them to have space. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate your feedback. This is a great group of people, and many of you have many different skills and work on the rivers, and it does take a team. As that first little picture of all of us, standing on the river, thinking about it, we all bring very many different skill sets and information. So I appreciate the partners being here at this meeting.
Lincoln?
Yeah, hi, Lincoln Prasco, the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I don't know if it's a question, just so much as a reflection on the slide that Ned had with the maximum sort of restoration and climate change bar graphs. And it felt a little doom and gloom to see, if we do everything we possibly can in the, I presume there was a river or wetland restoration tactic and climate change, then we don't really move the bar a whole bunch. And yeah, I'm wondering if that's maybe how Ned, maybe you were interpreting it, or if there's what other strategies or fixes, or maybe is there any light from that graph or things we can be doing in combination with those restoration techniques to move the bar a little bit more?
Lincoln, that's the right question. Absolutely. I am obsessed by that question. But here in Montpelier, I'm on the Montpelier Commission for recovery and resilience, or resilience and recovery. And one person's been doing a study about how to keep flooding out of Montpelier based on the historical record, not what's coming. But to do that, if you didn't want to have flooding in downtown Montpelier as it is, without adaptation, it would require something like 2 more dams the size of Wrightsville and East Barry to be installed somewhere like East Montpelier or Calais, or it's just crazy, the stuff that we can anticipate just to deal with what we know about in place. So we definitely need to be adapting and preparing for what we know about and what's very possible. And so far, the global, the oceans, of course, have absorbed enormous amounts of CO2 and been a blessing to the planet so far. They've also been absorbing tremendous amounts of heat. And now that's really appearing to be the expression of something that's a serious threat to all of us. So I guess I don't want to be doom and gloom. I would say that, it's not over. It's never going to be over. We're going to be wrestling with this for decades and generations, probably. So we need to be clearly mindful of the work ahead of us. Yeah. It doesn't go away. It's not like it stopped. Whatever happens, we still have more work to do. So thank you. But yeah, we got to stick together.
I'll follow up just briefly to Lincoln. Jeffersonville, Montgomery, Barry, many of those communities are taking or have taken active steps. It's not just restoration. If we're only restoring what's already been impacted, we really need to make sure we're working towards protecting of those things that are intact. The community of Jeffersonville saw a large development proposed right in the middle of a floodplain. The 2011 flood was a wake up to say, if that gets filled in, where does that water go? Where else in the community will that happen? It became important to protect it. How do we make sure, along with restoration, we're also doing conservation and other strategies that make us more holistic, because we'll never be able to restore ourselves if we're only continuing to have things be impacted, right? So we want to make that it's that combination of protection and restoration that will help us move that bar to be less quite dramatic that Ned's graph showed. So I think it's the communities have a real opportunity and are taking those strategies seriously. See some hands up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alice?
Yes, Staci just expressed the what I've been thinking of here in the Mad River Valley, specifically in Waitsfield. We've started a municipal planning project for our downtown area. And our downtown area in Irisville, very famously, at least to me, has a significant wetlands presence. And many of the wetlands have already been developed and kind of overrun. And the municipal planning grant, first piece, is supposedly to look at these wetlands and find out how we restore them, et cetera, et cetera. But my feeling is, listening to the goals and aims of the overall project, this is specifically geared towards where can we build, where can we develop? How do we delineate this? Can we use an in lieu program to open up more areas, et cetera? And my feeling about it is, why aren't you looking at the whole function of the floodplains? If you're doing a municipal planning project and you develop nice new areas for building and you improve the area, why would you not consider what Jeffersonville has done and look at flooding risks, how the wetlands mitigate that, and especially stormwater problems? in that area that we have studies on. We're ready to do projects, but we don't have private landowners' agreement that they should happen. But it seems to me that if you're going to build something, you also want to protect it. And I think they're missing an important piece of what they need to be looking at with this wetland area. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm kind of the fly on the wall, bugging the steering committee here. So I'm not afraid to say things maybe they don't want to hear. I just need some.
Alice, this is Staci. Thank you for being a person who is interested and brings that forward. To be a good comprehensive plan in the municipal plan, it is valuable and important to identify natural resource areas that could provide functions and benefits towards a number of goals, flood resiliency being one, community recreation, a number of things. So it should be a question and a part of the areas identified in the strategies for that planning effort. So continue to support or encourage that as messaging to the community. It's an opportunity at this point to identify those areas for multiple goals, and highlighting the flood resiliency component is just one piece of it. So thank you for being a person who brings that to your community.
I'm going to be 100 years old and still doing this.
That I'll just make a very funny comment. I've been cleaning out some of my things, and I came back across a 1980s Ranger Rick magazine.
Yes.
I don't know who here remembers Ranger Rick, but there's a wonderful little pledge for the Ranger Rick, and it's all about, observing and being part of nature. And I'm like, who knew when I was a kid that would guide my life? But wonderful that you're 100, would be 100 and still doing this work. Thank you, Alice. It's perfect.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more question from Adelaide.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name is Adelaide Dumb. I work for the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District. Staci, Ned, thank you so very much for presenting today. I was captivated by both of your presentations, and it's always great to become more knowledgeable of these processes and what we can do. My question is, if you're able to answer it. So we do a lot of work through the district, and I'm sort of wondering, taking all of this in and wondering in context, sort of where would the best bang for our buck be in terms of floodplain restoration? We do a lot of work with stream bank stability and riparian buffer plantings, dam removals, culvert replacements that are undersized. We're interested in doing passive restoration, both with beaver dam analogs and strategic wood additions. And then we also, have the outreach and education piece through working with smaller, more residential landowners to make recommendations for best management practices through our Storm Smart program and LakeWise. And we also work with agricultural producers. So in terms of floodplain, enhancement, restoration, flood resiliency work, if it's possible, and I know this might be an oversimplified question, but where would be the most effective, place to sort of target our future work?
I'm going to jump in really quick and then pass it on to Staci because she has the actual answer, the technical answer. But it's a lot of tools. We're all struggling with this, Adelaide, to figure out right place to be, and part of it's an issue of capacity and opportunity, right? And somebody who steps forward and is willing to play. So all these things. But I will mention that right now there's a big effort going on in Vermont that Vermont Emergency Management is doing. They're putting some money on the ground with engineers to look at flood resilience and basically floodplain reconnection, floodplain restoration opportunities, particularly in the most recently highly impacted communities, Ludlow and Johnson and Barry and Montpelier and Marshfield. So there's going to be a pretty interesting cluster of ideas that come out of that. And Montpelier, with the commission, kind of scratched around and found, look at this, old reports with 40 things that could be done, and so there's too much to be done. There's so much that could be done, and I think we're going to get a real polish on that, and some of those are really enormous projects, but to the extent that watershed groups see the co-benefits of working on all these things, inclusive of public safety and flood resilience, and as well as phosphorus, as well as habitat and recreation. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So anyway, watch for that. There's going to be a lot of things spinning out of that, and you're going to see the communities in Barry and Montpelier and other places, putting their fingers on the top 3 that they can possibly push, and there'll still be 30 after that. So there's going to be a real need for your help.
Certainly. And it's good to know about that funding source, Vermont Energy Management. Thank you. I'll keep my eyes and ears peeled for it. Yeah, it's just it's a lot to prioritize, and having the experts sort of point us in the right direction is extremely helpful. So what do you think, Staci?
Yeah, I'll just follow up, Adelaide, on Ned's comment. We could dig into the science areas later. I'm glad to follow up. There's the corridor plans and other information can help us kind of look. You may also connect with people like Alice, who could use some help thinking about their community area. To what are those wetland or other functional locations that consider as they look at natural resource needs, and maybe those help identify some floodplains that the community could work towards protection or conservation or strategies.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to follow up with you too. Yep.
Let's do it. Awesome.
Awesome. It looks like that was the last question, and we're just a little over 1 o'clock. So thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you Ned and Staci for presenting. Be on the lookout for a follow-up email with a feedback survey as well as links from today's presentation. Hope you all have a great day, and hope to see you at our next conversation in May.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.